Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
Often there's this sense or this assumption that Australian politics gets infected by American politics or is becoming Americanized. But, I think we're quite good at being terrible on our own.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and it has been quite a week in American politics. Since assuming the presidency, Donald Trump is doing pretty much exactly what he said he would do. He's rescinded a bunch of Joe Biden's executive orders, and he's been very busy issuing his own, beginning the process of implementing his radical agenda. It's been really hard to keep up with it all, and that's partly the point. Joining me today to talk about the first week of the Trump administration for this special Follow the Money After America crossover episode is Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. G'day, Emma.
Hey, Eb.
Emma, it has only been a week, but it feels like a year or potentially even longer than that. But let's start with the executive orders from the new president, Donald Trump. What has Donald Trump signed? Or maybe what hasn't he?
So Eb, he's signed a bunch of executive orders. The last time I counted, he was up to something like 78, but it'll be more by now. And he's also rescinded, so kind of withdrawn, I think it was over 20 of Joe Biden's executive orders. So, we can't go through them all. Some of them are pretty meaningless and kind of symbolic only. A lot of them will be challenged or already being challenged legally. But I guess the biggest ones that stood out to me, some of which haven't got that much attention just because of that onslaught. There's one that pauses all American foreign aid for at least 90 days. So the State Department is not allowed to continue providing aid to the rest of the world, which, is one of its main jobs. And just to kind of, I guess, put some numbers to that, according to the US Congressional Research Service, which is an independent research body, in 2023, American aid to the Pacific totaled $57.6 million US. And that, as far as we can tell, it's hard to get to the details, but as far as we can tell, that's just paused. That money is just not being delivered anymore, which has pretty serious consequences and obviously took a lot of people in the State Department and in USAID by surprise.
So that wasn't necessarily something that he had flagged before, like some of the other ones that he put through. So it was a shock, was it?
Look, it hadn't been flagged by Trump specifically, but it had been flagged by a lot of the people that were making plans for the Trump presidency. So in things like Project 2025, for example, there were recommendations, to review all American foreign aid, to pause it until it had been reviewed and okayed. So, they did tell us that this is what they were going to do. I think part of the problem was that a lot of people and people who needed to didn't believe them and so didn't prepare. And we're seeing the consequences of that now.
Today we come together to address a matter of great significance, the integrity of American citizenship.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about.
President Trump has made it clear that restoring fairness to our immigration system and defending the true intent of the 14th Amendment are central to his vision of making America great again.
The judge just issued a temporary restraining order, putting a nationwide block, at least temporarily, on Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship.
So the other ones that I wanted to talk about was birthright citizenship that looks like it will be almost immediately challenged as being unconstitutional. It's not the first time that Trump has done something like that and then had the courts overturn it. But I just wonder, with a Supreme Court that was handpicked by him and the numbers heavily favour, is there a chance that that will just go differently this time? And even though on most scholars, reading of it, it is unconstitutional, that we could even see a different outcome if it goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
Look, Eb, I think the first thing to say is that it is absolutely unconstitutional. Like there's no question there. There's a kind of faux academic debate being had in bad faith about this, but it is so clearly in the Constitution and cannot be changed by executive order. And Trump doesn't care about that, but Trump and the people around him know that that's the case, and it's already, for that reason, it's already being challenged in the courts. A federal court has basically rejected it and said this is clearly unconstitutional, but it will make its way up. And I think, as you said, exactly, that's where the Supreme Court comes in, and there's a sense of disbelief, I think, that the Supreme Court would allow an executive order like that to stand because it is so clearly unconstitutional, but Trump has very successfully packed the court, and I think it's probably more likely that they will do what he wants them to do. They may give themselves some wriggle room, and it'll be a while before we know that, but I think, we can't underestimate how much Trump and the people around him have captured those institutions. There's this constant sense in kind of media coverage, especially in the United States, that, he can't do that because it's illegal. He can't possibly go that far, and he keeps doing it. We keep seeing this pattern repeat. So that is a really worrying one. And of course, it's also really worrying what happens in the meantime. Who is listening or I guess who's obeying that pause on allowing birthright citizenship to go ahead. So, issuing people documents and things like that when there are delays in that, alongside all of the other executive orders that Trump is issuing around immigration, which are already leading to increases in raids, which are also picking up bystanders. Like I was reading an article today that the Navajo Nation is really worried because Native Americans are being caught up in these raids. So the effects are really widespread and really frightening, and are already having a huge impact on communities. So yeah, it is really frightening, and I think probably the court system, because he's stacked it so well, will probably support Trump in what he's doing.
Yeah, well, I guess after Roe v. Wade, I wouldn't be shocked anymore, but it is shocking that that's kind of how much the American system has deteriorated, I guess, and you would hope particularly those kinds of institutions would withstand this kind of politics, but yeah, there's not good reason to hope, I guess. And Emma, there is a lot more going on than just the executive orders, and obviously we can't cover everything, but what are some of the key things that you think matter the most from this initial period post-inauguration?
Yeah, thanks, Eb. Again, it's it's hard to kind of pull it apart because there is such a fire hose, of information. But a few other things have stood out to me aside from that onslaught of executive orders. One is an incident that happened yesterday at the time of recording, so kind of Sunday US time, Monday our time, where the United States is sending immigrants back to their countries of origin in South America, so sending plane loads of people back to Brazil or Colombia, for example, which is a long-standing practice, but it sounds like the actual practice of it is changing in that, the department is not sending people back on civilian planes. They've started sending them back on military planes and putting them in shackles and things like that. And there was a moment where the Colombian president refused to allow a couple of planes to land in Colombia with immigrants that escalated into a kind of Twitter tit for tat between two leaders where Trump was threatening Colombia with 25% tariffs if they didn't allow the planes to land, that would then increase to 50% tariffs if that went on for a week. And then the Colombian president kind of coming back with some really strong language about standing up to white supremacy and white slavers. And, you know, it got really serious and had potentially really serious economic implications for both countries, you know, aside from everything else. And the media coverage of it was appalling, you know, in the way that it framed this as a kind of Twitter beef between two people, and in a way that framed the Colombian president in particular as responding in a ridiculous way, because he talked about racism and he talked about the way the United States has treated Latin America and Latin American leaders in particular. And then, you know, when this issue was somehow resolved, there was this big kind of debate about who'd won, like who'd had the political victory. And, you know, the general assessment was that, of course, Trump had won. And it's just, I mean, I guess, you know, it's a relatively small incident on the scale of Trump, in the scale of Trump world. But it, again, really stood out in both, you know, the way Trump is willing to threaten allies and risk huge destabilization in the way that they treat people, and in the way that the media covers these issues. And especially from Australia, you know, the way it's covered suggests that none of that will ever happen to us.
Yeah, that we might be the exemption from the leopards eating faces party consequences. Exactly. Just a side note for people who didn't understand that reference or didn't catch that reference, the leopards eating people's faces party basically refers to a tweet that then became a meme about regretful voters who vote for one particular party or other, not thinking that their hideous policies will end up applying for them. And the whole tweet is, "I never thought leopards would eat my face," sobs a woman who voted for the leopards eating people's faces party. So just a note, for if that reference didn't make sense for you, that's where it comes from. I guess, I mean, that just points to, and it happened in his first presidency as well, this willingness to create chaos and unleash kind of unknown consequences in the knowledge, I guess, that America is the biggest gorilla in the room kind of thing, and not worrying about any of those consequences. And some of the times they're not even necessarily over critical policies even to Trump. So, yeah, I guess very disappointing to hear that that's how the media kind of covered it in that kind of horse race manner. But you did write this week in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age about that this onslaught of news and executive orders and all of that kind of stuff is all part of a plan. What did you mean by that?
Sure. So I think, like a lot of people, I've gone back to that Steve Bannon quote. So Steve Bannon, who is one of the original architects, really, of the Trump movement and the Make America Great Again movement, he's not part of the administration this time around. He's not at the center of power, but he still has a really big influence on the broader movement and how it's thinking and what it's talking about. And he said in 2018 that the media is the enemy, and the way to deal with the enemy is to flood the zone. And what he means is to just have that onslaught of continuous news, you know, executive order after executive order, crisis after crisis, incident after incident, you know, even if it's a stupid Twitter thing, because what that does is overwhelm the media completely and make them lose their ability to report the stakes, right? Which is something that the media has talked about amongst itself for a long time now, but still, you know, hasn't really been able to tackle in an effective way. And that happened the first time around. Like, you know, I'm sure we're not alone in kind of feeling that, like, Trump redux, that all of a sudden you're sucked back into this universe where, you know, you cannot keep up with the detail. It's impossible to be across everything that they are doing. But that's exactly the point. And I think the important thing, though, is that this time it's really different, because that absolutely happened last time, but it wasn't directed. You know, it was Trump kind of firing off all the time without a real strategy behind it. And that's not the case this time. So all of those executive orders that Trump has signed, for example, were ready for him. You know, they've been written by the architects of Project 2025 and other figures, and they had them ready. They still have them ready to hand to him in a way that they just didn't the first time around. And those executive orders, again, in a way that they weren't the first time around, are designed to reward the people that brought Trump to power. You know, they're designed to culturally and politically and even materially reward his base and so further kind of cement them in, make them feel like they're part of this in-group and that they have power. And that, I guess the kind of flip side of that is as well that it really disempowers opposition to Trump, you know, that onslaught that you can't keep up with, where organizations are trying to litigate, they're trying to sue the administration for individual things that's doing, can really disempower a movement against Trump, and it can entirely understandably foster disengagement because people feel powerless in the face of that onslaught.
Yeah, because I guess there's so many different fires to put out. Essentially, that's the strategy, isn't it? You know, little fires everywhere, and everyone's just trying to hose them down and leaves them missing the bigger picture or unable to engage or tied up doing those little things.
Yeah, 100%.
Or not little, I guess, but, you know, just having to deal with all those consequences.
You know, there are elections that come and go. Some elections are, you know, important, some are not. But this one this one really mattered. And I just want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you. My heart goes out to you. It is thanks to you that the future of civilization is assured.
I did also want to talk about Elon Musk and this kind of much more government for sale approach where billionaires used to be kind of insulated from government decisions by their wealth, but now Elon Musk is very much in government and directing things. I mean, they've always had access to the administrations at high levels and all of those kinds of things, but this has kind of, I guess, turbocharged it, so to speak. What are your observations on that and where it will end up? Because Elon Musk seems to have as big an ego as Trump does. So I can't see it lasting long, but the damage or the consequences of it might last for a long time.
Yeah, I think they will. And it's one of, you know, the question of who has the bigger ego, Donald Trump or Elon Musk, is a really it's a really difficult one to answer. Look, I think you're so right that those, you know, billionaires, possibly soon to be trillionaires, have always been a huge part of American politics. They've always been right at the center. Just most of the time they've been better about being quiet about it, you know, and not so public like that. Musk is there and is able to be there because those structures are already in place. You know, it's like so many things with Trump. This is not new. It's just exactly as you said, it's turbocharged. Musk is a wild one, you know, I think, because you're right. He is kind of apparently at the center of things and ready to effectively dismantle a lot of the agencies and departments of the federal government so that they can't, you know, deliver what government is supposed to deliver, even in the fairly inadequate way that, you know, the American system has been delivering. And of course, what that will do is then further undermine faith in the ability of the state to deliver things for people to make their lives better, which then further reinforces, you know, the political arguments and persuasion of people like Musk and Trump. So you get kind of sucked into this vicious cycle, which again is entirely the point. I think, you know, Musk, I'm sort of in two minds with Musk because I think it's also entirely possible that he is going to encounter a kind of political resistance to what he's trying to do that he's just never encountered before. You know, he's always worked for business where you can walk in, especially in the United States, and just do whatever you want. You know, he can fire whoever he wants without any effective guardrails. He hasn't worked with, and this is not a slide on public servants, he hasn't worked with public servants before who understand how systems of power work and how to use, you know, regulations to, I guess, push back quietly on what Musk might try to do, or, you know, be very effective at saying, yes, sure, like we'll do that, and then not do it at all. Like public servants are very good at that. And I don't I don't think he is emotionally prepared for that kind of resistance. So how he reacts to that, I think, will be really important to watch. But I think it's also, it's at the same time, this is what I mean about being in two minds, it's easy to underestimate him because he is so cringe. Like he's so embarrassing and says the most ridiculous things, but then his politics is also terrifying. Like, you know, to go back to that, what the media was calling a Nazi-style salute that he did twice at that post-inauguration rally for Donald Trump. You know, the media then kind of goes into this frenzy about, like, did he mean it? Did he mean to do white supremacy? Like, of course he did. All you have to do is look through his Twitter feed and the things he said in the last several years, which are clear indications of his white supremacist politics that he now wants to extend, you know, literally out from planet Earth to Mars. Like he sees himself as this kind of white civilizational messiah, and how that, like the scale of that ego might clash with Trump when Trump decides, you know, that going to Mars is a stupid idea and he doesn't care about it anymore, will be pretty epic. And exactly as you say, you know, what is the damage going to be from that clash? What is the fallout going to be from that clash? Not to mention, you know, all the things that Musk is going to do in those federal government agencies and departments.
And I also wonder, like, how he's going to go in countering, because he seems much more like, I guess if I would distinguish it this way, it would be a lot of other billionaires, not all of them obviously, but just seem interested in like removing competition and making as much money as possible, right? Whereas Musk seems much more interested in the ideological fight. Like he's in there for those reasons, and he's not necessarily motivated by a profit motive, even though he's obviously making squillions of dollars hand over fist. But you talked about the public service, but I wonder too, like, I guess American allies in Europe and elsewhere must be worried about how X has been weaponized in a political sense, and, you know, that willingness to interfere, not just for business sake, but just to, I guess, stir shit, essentially, seems to distinguish him a bit from the others. Obviously, we've always had people like the Koch brothers and things trying to accomplish these agendas in the background, but he's very brazen about it. Do you think we might see, I guess, more pushback from allies and I guess the international community trying to contain his damage to the United States as much as possible?
I mean, I think other leaders are really worried, rightly, about what he's going to do because, you know, he's already kind of sticking his nose into national politics in Germany, in the UK, for example. But I think it's also, I guess, as I was saying before, you know, it's, or maybe even to contradict myself, it's possible to overestimate his power there. You know, he does have a huge amount of influence in, you know, directing the news cycle. You know, he just has to tweet about UK politics or whatever, and everybody kind of goes into a complete tears. But it is also possible to push back against that kind of interference. You know, Europe and the European Union in particular has been quite good at, well, relatively good at regulating those kind of tech companies and information and money as well. And there's no reason that they can't do that. You know, Musk is really powerful. He does have a lot of influence, but he's also one guy and he's not that rich relative to the entire European Union, for example. So it is entirely possible to push back on him. And, you know, he's not that complicated a guy either. Like it's possible to kind of provoke him and get him to say and do stupid things so people don't take him as seriously. So, you know, my hope is that people will push back, and that certainly an Australian government might push back when he, you know, almost inevitably starts talking about the Australian federal election. You know, it'll be very interesting to see how the rest of the world kind of deals with this super weird guy.
And we saw over the weekend, I guess, if we want to talk about the Australian context, that opposition leader Peter Dutton announced that Jacinta Price is going to take on an Elon Musk-style government efficiency portfolio. I mean, is this as straightforward as Aussie politicians taking cues from the Trump administration, or do you think there's more to it?
I think it is, and it isn't that straightforward. You know, this is it's such an embarrassing copycat move, isn't it? Like, it's so cringeworthy, but it is drawn exactly from the Trump playbook, and I think it's designed to kind of troll the media as well. It's not a serious move. It is kind of gleeful though. I think there's been a lot of crowing from conservatives in Australia about the Trump victory and what it might say about Australian politics. But I think it's also really important to say, often there's this sense or this assumption that Australian politics gets infected by American politics or is becoming Americanized. But, I think we're quite good at being terrible on our
we've
own.
exported a bunch of our own terrible policies to the UK in particular.
Exactly. And to the United States. Trump has expressed a lot of admiration in the past for Australian immigration policy, for example. He partly modelled, as the UK did, some of their harshest policies and messaging on Australian policy. So, we're just as good at that kind of terrible politics. But it is at the same time, I think, an example of how that Trumpian mode of politics, the retail politics, is being deliberately brought to Australia by the opposition and by the media as well. I was particularly struck, of course, the Price example is a really clear one, but there's also been in the media an effort to kind of not necessarily import, but reinforce the kind of culture war politics that Trump is so good at, especially around gender. So in Trump's inauguration speech, listeners might remember he had this line about there being only two genders and has since issued this executive order about it as well.
This week, I will also end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
And then in Australia, Josh Taylor, who's a journalist for The Guardian, has pointed out that Sky News journalists have been asking Australian political figures about their opinions on Trump's proclamation about gender. So the Victorian Premier, Jacinta Allen, for example, got asked what she thought about it by a Sky News journalist. And as Josh Taylor has pointed out, what happens then is these journalists will ask a leader about their position on gender, and then when they respond appropriately, as Jacinta Allen did, to just be like really? Why are we talking about this? That then gets framed as a diplomatic slight against Trump.
Yep.
These leaders are creating a security risk for Australia because they're disagreeing with Trump's opinions on gender. And you can see that pattern kind of repeating where they're, journalists are trying to catch out Australian political leaders to create this diplomatic incident with Trump and reinforce those culture war issues that are so effective or have been so effective in the United States at redirecting blame away from, the people who are causing the problems, people like Trump and Elon Musk, to vulnerable groups of people. And that's a tactic that's not limited to either country.
So, Emma, we're about 1 week in. How's it all going? How are you feeling about it after knowing this was coming for so long? I mean, is it roughly what you expected? Is it better? Is it worse? How are you feeling after a week? What's your assessment of this first week and what it means for portends for things to come?
I think it's both exactly what I expected and worse. I keep saying I was intellectually prepared for what it would be, but not emotionally, which I think is something that most people share. Look, I'm both heartened by the response to the second Trump administration and worried by it as well, especially here in Australia. There was another moment that really stood out to me last week where the Australian Defence Minister, Richard Marles, was asked if Australia would militarily support the United States if it went after the Panama Canal or Greenland. And, in many ways, that's a kind of gotcha hypothetical question that maybe a politician shouldn't engage in because that's just kind of adding fuel to the Trump fire. That's maybe the generous interpretation. But the best answer that the Defence Minister could come up with was a very familiar one about how the US alliance is the cornerstone of Australian foreign policy and the cornerstone of Australian national security. And that's entirely unsurprising and predictable that he would give that answer. But it's still, when you think about it, it's still pretty wild that a defence minister of an Australian government that says over and over again that it's committed to an international rules-based order wouldn't just say a flat out no. Like, Australia is committed to the foundational principles of international law, which mean you don't invade sovereign countries to take them over.
Full stop.
The fact that, exactly. The fact that he couldn't say that is not exactly heartening.
Which is really the bare minimum. I mean, God, that's how bonkers the first week has been, that we didn't even touch on the Panama Canal or buying Greenland. Is it buying, or is he going to invade Greenland as well?
No, it's escalated from buying to to annexing. Or he said this week that the people of Greenland want to be Americans, which the people of Greenland had a few things to say about.
But who cares what they think?
Exactly.
Oh, my goodness. Well, let's strap ourselves in, shall we? Because, it's a marathon, not a sprint, to get through this, and who knows where it'll all end up. But I rest easier, Emma, knowing that you're analysing everything that's going on there and helping us sort out what to pay attention to, because we're all subject to that flooding the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon so eloquently put it all those years ago. And it really is hard to cut through all of that and think about actually what really matters for the world and for Australia. So thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much, Eb.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to After America, Emma's weekly show on American and global politics, wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 28th of January, and no doubt a bunch of things will have changed since then. If you want to join us at our Climate Integrity Summit in Canberra on Wednesday, the 12th of February, you can get your tickets via our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or tap the link in the show notes. And we would love to hear your thoughts on the show today. Or if you've got any questions for us, you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au or find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute with an AUS on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.